This is Audible Bleeding, the vascular surgery podcast. We're here to help you keep your finger on the pulse. Well, welcome back to Audible Bleeding. We are starting a new session called Meet the Author today. It's in our collaboration with the Journal for Vascular Surgery. And today we have Dr. Jessica Mayer. She is the first author of the Editor's Choice article from this month called Using the Society for Vascular Surgery Wound, Ischemia, and Foot Infection Classification to Identify Patients Most Likely to Benefit from Revascularization. So thanks, Dr. Mayer, for joining us on the podcast, and we're happy to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited and honored to be the first author featured and to just be on this podcast, which I actually listened to myself.
Well, great. So we'll just start with a little bit about yourself and where you are in your training and career.
Sure. So I'm actually originally from South Florida. Somehow I did all of my education in Florida and then now have made it to Texas. I am currently a fourth-year general surgery resident at Baylor College of Medicine, and I will be applying for fellowship in vascular surgery in the next couple months.
Well, fantastic. So hopefully some of the program directors out there are listening to this. And what got you interested in vascular surgery?
So it's actually kind of been a long process. I started general surgery, not totally sure what I wanted to do. I really have to give a lot of credit to my two of my primary mentors, Dr. Joseph Mills and Dr. J.R. Chung here at Baylor College of Medicine. I really didn't have a lot of exposure to vascular surgery at all when I was a medical student, which I think is something that I know the SVS has kind of talked about, finding ways to recruit medical students even earlier on, especially now with all the integrated programs. But, just in my time during my clinical rotations, I really have enjoyed the patients. I've enjoyed how complicated they are, all of the different things that you have to think about to keep them healthy and safe. We do a lot of complex limb salvage here at Baylor. There's a never-ending source of learning and continuing to grow. And I've really gotten a lot of satisfaction out of taking care of these patients. I'm actually on a vascular service right now, which is super exciting. But yeah, it's just kind of just getting more and more exposure and talking to my mentors and asking them why they really love what they do. And I just figured out that it was, the right thing for me.
Wonderful. Well, we're glad to have you join the field. So we'll dive a little bit into the project. This is featured and published in the JVS in the month of September. It's been highlighted as the Editor's Choice, and there is a fantastic YouTube video where Dr. Levitsky gives a nice summary and features a visual abstract associated with the paper. And then we have talked about it a bit on our podcast with Dr. Levitsky as well. So we wanted to hear from you, how you got involved with the project and a little bit of the story behind how this paper came to be.
Yeah, sure. So I did a couple years of some research time in the middle of my residency, as many of us do. And Dr. Mills and Dr. Chung, who I mentioned before, were kind of my primary mentors. And, a little bit of background on Wi-Fi itself. I'm sure a lot of listeners kind of already know a little bit about Wi-Fi, but basically this is a classification system to better fully describe the extent of disease in the affected limb in patients with PAD. And it uses the degree of the wound, the degree of ischemia, and the severity of foot infection to kind of completely classify the wound. But the Wi-Fi classification system was developed by Delphi consensus. Basically, a bunch of experts in the field kind of put their heads together and, determined what limbs what they thought would, number one, be most likely to end up amputated in a natural course, and number two, which ones would be most likely to benefit from revascularization. That's why in the initial paper, there are these two tables that kind of describe both of those things. So, Dr. Mills he was actually the lead author on that initial Wi-Fi paper that came out in the JVS in 2014. And he kind of wanted to see, now that more and more papers were coming out utilizing Wi-Fi, wanted to see how, Wi-Fi actually correlated with clinical outcomes. So he and I decided, well, why don't we just reach out to everybody, get their data for everybody who's kind of published everything up to date. Unfortunately, the data was basically just Wi-Fi classification for that limb and whether or not that limb was amputated. That was really kind of the challenge, and I guess I can get into a little bit more of that later. put it all together and kind of see, does Wi-Fi really represent how these limbs do in real life?
When did you guys start this process?
I think we started about July, August 2 years ago, so 2017. So July, August 2017. It took several months to kind of get data from everybody, put everything together. And then once we had it, kind of finalizing what we were going to do with it, kind of took a little bit of time. Some of the papers had revascularized limbs and limbs that were not revascularized. Some just had revascularized limbs. So kind of putting it all together and figuring out the best way to see how these limbs actually performed relative to Wi-Fi was kind of the initial challenge. So I actually met several times with our department. We're lucky enough that our department has a statistician. Funny enough, she and I were actually office mates for a decent part of my research time, so I actually got to know her pretty well. I'm sure that actually helped me out in the end. But she and I kind of came together and sat down, and I was like, how do we see if all of these limbs with all of these Wi-Fi scores and all of their amputation rates, how do they actually compare? And she suggested using a cluster analysis, which is something that I had previously never heard of before.
Yeah, no, so this is pretty complicated statistics in this paper. So it's great that you had that collaboration with the statistician in putting this together, because it's tough to really identify which analysis is best to do and things like that. So yeah, if you can talk a little bit more how you made that collaboration as useful as possible in this paper.
Yeah. I mean, it's collaboration on multiple levels because, collaborating with all of these centers, which, as somebody, is still as a resident, I think is kind of initially pretty daunting. But knowing that, my mentors had, pretty decent relationships with all of these different institutions, that certainly helped me. And then, just sitting down, not only does our statistician obviously have a lot of knowledge, but Dr. Chung, one of my mentors, he has a really strong statistics knowledge. And the two of them actually kind of sat together and we kind of went back and forth on kind of what to do. Basically, cluster analysis, this is going to be a very, very oversimplified version, but it kind of uses means and distances from means to basically find naturally occurring groups in unsorted data. That's basically kind of the best way that I can describe it. So it's just an evolutionary process, kind of going back and forth. And I think it probably took us a month or two to kind of really get to where we think the final way we were going to set this up statistically. I think one of the major kind of limitations is that I really, like I said before, I really only had the whether or not the limb was amputated and how many limbs we had for each possible Wi-Fi combination. If I had been able to have, maybe some background demographic data or, other outcome measures or other things, I think then maybe we could have separated it more. But because that was literally all of the data that I had, I think the analyses that we had were a nice package together.
It really speaks to the quality of the Wi-Fi criteria in that when you analyze the model, it accounted for 90% or so of the variation that you saw in outcomes was just Wi-Fi by itself, which I think is really speaks to the power of the Wi-Fi criteria in predicting outcomes, and then also, maybe predicting the benefit from revascularization. So I think that's fantastic. So what was something that, other than maybe the statistics, that you learned while working on the project that you maybe weren't expecting to learn through this process?
I think I didn't have a lot of expectations up front as to what I necessarily was going to learn or not. I mean, research, I think, especially for maybe people who aren't as far along in their training and maybe haven't done as much research before, I think it takes some time, but you realize that research is never exactly linear and things always take longer than you think that they're going to take. Um, so I think I kind of had those kind of expectations up front. But I think really for me, this kind of overall, this kind of response to the paper, I was fortunate enough to get to present it at the plenary session at VAM, not this past VAM, but last VAM last June, which was also nerve wracking in and of itself in front of like 1,000 people. But yeah, I don't know that there was really something specific that was like super, super surprising about it. I just think knowing that I was happy that Wi-Fi, while it is not perfect, while it may need to have some slight adjustments over time, that we have something better than we have had before to fully describe the extent of disease of these patients.
And what would you say is the next step for this project?
So I think we could do maybe a couple different things. I need to sit down, with Dr. Mills and Dr. Chung again and see what our next major step will be. But we could repeat this study, and instead of looking at just the limbs that were revascularized, that second table in the initial Wi-Fi paper, we could kind of look at, find a cohort of patients who did not undergo revascularization and see how predictive Wi-Fi is of their 1-year amputation rates without any intervention. So that's kind of a sister project. And then a bigger thing we could do was to get maybe prospective data with more granularity, more variables on both revascularized or non-revascularized limbs, and then really see kind of how, with more numbers and more variables, how well does Wi-Fi really do in actual patients. So I think bigger and more variables.
And then, as we start to get more data on, how we can use Wi-Fi and how it correlates either with outcomes or with, the impact of interventions, how can we improve how clinicians can use Wi-Fi at the bedside? Any plans for an app or some sort of integration with an EMR so that, we can kind of help clinicians calculate Wi-Fi and use it for decision making in real time?
Yeah, I mean, currently the Wi-Fi, there's on the SVS app, you can put in your patient's information and get your Wi-Fi score. So you don't necessarily have to be carrying around a table. So that's a really nice thing that the SVS has kind of already done. I think for us in particular, I don't necessarily, I'd have to really kind of sit and think about what the best way would be to kind of disseminate this, especially since I think Wi-Fi is still continuing to evolve. Things change over time. I think when Wi-Fi was initially developed, it was supposed to be kind of similar to TNM cancer staging, right? You have 3 different variables, you put them together, and you get a stage. But as like we know from cancer, they go back and they reevaluate, and those staging systems change over time, kind of based on new data or new modalities or things like that. So I think Wi-Fi would probably end up being maybe akin to that, and it may not be a set in stone, at least over the next couple of years as we get more information. It's only been 5 years since we've had Wi-Fi. But yeah, I think having an app or some more kind of information for people at the bedside and kind of really incorporating it, or maybe finding ways to incorporate it into EMRs would be super. We should probably really sit down and talk with that. That's the next thing I need to go talk to Dr. Mills about.
Well, nice, fantastic. Yeah, I think it's a great analogy comparing this to cancer staging, and we've made that comparison multiple times on how cancer and limb salvage are there's a lot of parallels. So any advice you would give someone in your same position starting maybe a similar project?
I think really mentorship is very key. I know I could not have done it. I know I mentioned it several times, but I could not have done it without the mentors that I have. And just kind of, keeping your head up, keeping persisting. Like there's a lot of things that people have done that maybe they didn't think that they could have done. But if you, have good clinical questions and, you put your head down and stay focused, I think these are, things that residents and medical students, can do. And just be open to learning new skills and just keep asking questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mayer, for joining us on our podcast. Anything last words you want to leave our listeners with?
Subscribe to Audible Bleeding. Read the JVS and see if you can get a copy of my paper.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's free for the month of September on the JVS website. So everyone should be able to read it for at least the next month. They should download it quickly and get on it. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We are Audible Bleeding, the vascular surgery podcast. We'd like to make our listeners aware that there are still a few spots left to register for the Big Apple Boot Camp in New York City, New York, on September 19th to the 21st. This is a 2-day skills course intended for first-year vascular fellows or third or fourth year integrated